Hi, I'm Jeff Richards, and welcome to Japan Today Spotlight. Japan is one of only two G7 countries that still uses the death penalty. The United States is the other. Executions are carried out by hanging here. They are conducted in secret. Families and lawyers are not informed in advance of the sentence being carried out. Despite international pressure and repeated calls for abolition, public support for capital punishment in Japan remains high. In this week's Japan Today Spotlight, we look at why capital punishment still exists in Japan, how it's carried out, how it compares globally, and why the death penalty remains part of Japan's justice system after more than a century. As of now, there are 105 people on death row in Japan. Opponents of the death penalty here argue that Japan's system is especially cruel because inmates aren't told about their execution date until just hours beforehand. Their families and lawyers aren't notified either, a policy that the government uses to prevent last-minute appeals. So how are executions carried out? The Justice Ministry has allowed media access to an execution chamber only one time, in 2010, under a Democratic Party of Japan-led government. Executions in Japan are carried out by hanging. That method has been in use since 1873. Before that, executions were performed by decapitation. Hanging was adopted during the Meiji era, reportedly on the advice of a French legal advisor who argued it was more humane because the body could be returned to the family intact. Under the current system, the condemned person is informed of the execution only 1 or 2 hours beforehand. After being told, the inmate may be offered a small snack or a drink. There is no last meal request like those often portrayed in movies and television dramas. He is then taken from his cell, blindfolded, and hands cuffed behind his back. The execution itself takes place inside a specially built chamber. On the floor is a red square, marking the spot where the inmate is positioned. Beyond a glass partition hidden by blue curtains, stand officials including a public prosecutor, the detention center chief, and other senior officials who oversee the execution. At a signal from a senior official, 3 prison officers press buttons at the same time. Only one of those buttons activates the mechanism. When it does, the floor beneath the red square drops away, opening a hole. The inmate then falls out of sight and is hanged until a doctor confirms death. Critics also say the hanging itself can prolong the suffering, with some condemned inmates reportedly taking up to 20 minutes before their death is confirmed. There are no public witnesses. Family members and lawyers are informed only after the execution has been carried out. One reason the death penalty has drawn renewed attention in Japan is the case of Iwao Hakamata. In 2024, Hakamata was acquitted in a retrial after spending nearly half a century on death row. He had been convicted of the 1966 murder of 4 members of a family in Shizuoka Prefecture. The court ruled that investigators had fabricated evidence, including a key confession. Hakamata was released after 47 years and 7 months behind bars, most of that time spent under a death sentence. Now nearing 90 years old, he was awarded 217 million yen, about $1.5 million in compensation for this wrongful conviction. His case was also recognized by Guinness World Records as the longest time anyone has ever spent on death row, before being exonerated. Hakamata's lawyers say the damage he suffered can't be measured in money. They argue that living for decades without knowing whether each day could be his last caused severe psychological and physical harm. For opponents of the death penalty, the case highlights a central concern. Once an execution is carried out, there's no way to undo a mistake. Yet, supporters of capital punishment argue that Hakamata's acquittal shows that the system ultimately worked, even if it took decades. The case continues to shape how the death penalty is discussed in Japan today. A government survey released in February 2025 found that 83.1% of respondents support capital punishment. It was the fifth straight survey, conducted every 5 years, in which the support topped 80%. The most common reason given was concern for the feelings of victims of capital crimes and their families. More than 60% said the death penalty reflects those feelings. Over half said violent crime should be paid for with the lives of the offenders. And more than 50% said abolishing the death penalty could lead to an increase in violent crime. Among those who support abolition, a record high number pointed to the risk of a wrongful conviction. More than 70% said mistaken convictions are irreversible, a response many observers link directly to the Hakamata case. Others said the death penalty should be abolished, but only if Japan introduces life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. That option, however, remains rare in Japan and has not replaced capital punishment as a sentencing alternative. Successive governments have said the death penalty reflects public sentiment and remains an appropriate punishment for the most serious crimes. Earlier this year, the Osaka District Court rejected a lawsuit filed by 3 death row inmates who argued that execution by hanging is inhumane and violates international conventions banning cruel punishment. All 3 have been on death row for more than 10 years. One inmate, however, has been waiting far longer. A 64-year-old man has been on death row for 40 years as of January. No Japanese prime minister or politician has ever tried to abolish the death penalty. In a 1948 ruling, the court said the death penalty doesn't violate Article 36 of the Constitution, which bans cruel punishment. In a later 1955 decision, it found no special reason to consider hanging inhumane when compared with execution methods used in other countries. Japan's Supreme Court has consistently upheld the practice. That includes reform-minded leaders like Naoto Kan and Yukio Hatoyama. In office, even politicians who've expressed personal discomfort have stopped short of pushing for change. Successive governments have taken the same position. Public support is high, the courts say the death penalty is constitutional, and so the system remains. Responsibility instead falls to the justice minister. By law, every execution requires the justice minister's signature. Some ministers who oppose capital punishment have delayed signing the execution orders, sometimes for months or longer. But delaying a signature doesn't suspend a death sentence. It actually extends the period of uncertainty for the inmate, often adding years to their life on death row. Critics argue that hesitation may ease a minister's conscience, but it also deepens the very suffering they say that they oppose. Executions eventually resume. The system continues. Japan isn't alone in using the death penalty, but it is increasingly isolated among advanced democracies. In the G7 countries, Japan and the United States are the only two that still carry out executions. In the US, more than 2,000 people are currently on death row, roughly 20 times the number than Japan. Even so, executions and new death sentences in the US have been declining for decades. Several states have abolished capital punishment or placed moratoriums on its use. Globally, executions are far more common elsewhere. Amnesty International says more than 1,500 executions were confirmed in 15 countries in 2024. Most of these took place in Middle Eastern countries, including Iran and Saudi Arabia. And that figure doesn't include China, where execution data is treated as a state secret, and it's believed to be much higher. Other countries that carried out executions in 2024 included Egypt, Singapore, Yemen, and the aforementioned United States. In some of those countries, people can be sentenced to death for crimes other than murder. In Japan, that's generally not the case. The death penalty is typically reserved for multiple murders or particularly serious crimes, such as those committed by the Aum Shinrikyo cult, whose leader and 12 senior members were executed in 2018. There have also been cases in Japan where defendants openly said they wanted to be executed, and some of them got their wish. One was the man who stabbed 8 children to death at an elementary school in Osaka Prefecture in 2001. Another carried out a deadly rampage in Tokyo's Akihabara district in 2008, killing 7 people. And more recently, the man convicted of killing 36 people in a 2019 arson attack at Kyoto Animation was sentenced to death in 2024. He told his lawyer not to appeal, saying he wants to be executed. The last execution carried out in Japan was in June of 2025. A 35-year-old man, dubbed Japan's Twitter killer, was hanged for murdering, dismembering, and storing the bodies of 9 victims, all of whom had posted suicidal thoughts on social media. Before that, no one had been executed in Japan since 2022. What's often missing from discussions about the death penalty is the perspective of the people who have to carry it out. In Japan, there's no official job called executioner. Those who take part are ordinary corrections officers assigned internally by prison management. They don't volunteer for the role, and they aren't chosen at random. Officers assigned to death row units understand that participation in executions may become part of their duties over time, alongside other routine work inside the prison. Selection is based on internal judgment, seniority, reliability, and the ability to follow procedure rather than personal belief. The role isn't permanent. An officer may take part once, several times, or only briefly over the course of a career. There's no formal right for prison officers to refuse participation in an execution. There's no opt-out system that's written into the law. Officers who struggle with the role may sometimes be quietly reassigned or rotated away from death row duties, but that's handled informally and isn't guaranteed. Refusing outright won't stop an execution. Another officer takes the role. The execution goes ahead as planned. Satoru Ohashi, a former Director General of the Justice Ministry's Corrections Bureau, has said prison officers keep a tight lid on their emotions and carry out executions as a prescribed duty. He's described the process as something close to a ritual, one that must be followed exactly. On the death penalty itself, Ohashi has said that as long as it remains part of Japan's justice system, it must be carried out faithfully. But he also acknowledged that it's not a job anyone would actively want to do. In a rare interview with Japanese media in June 2025, a former prison officer in his 70s described what it was like to take part in executions. He had worked for many years at a detention center and was involved in multiple hangings. He said his hands never trembled, even as he placed the noose around the condemned man's neck. He forced himself to stay steady, he said, because he didn't want to embarrass himself or disrupt the procedures. Although he'd been trained to restrain prisoners if they resisted, he said no one ever fought back. Years later, long after leaving the job, the memories haven't faded. He said that every morning when he clasps his hands in prayer at home, the faces of the men he helped execute suddenly appear in his mind. He said he doesn't know why. Japan's death penalty remains firmly in place. It's upheld by the courts, carried out largely away from public view, and governed by a tightly prescribed legal process, but deeply opaque. For now, there's little political momentum to change that system. From the Japan Today newsroom in Tokyo, I'm Jeff Richards.